Good evening. Good to see everyone again. The mark of a great leader is to state clearly the conditions that must be met by those who follow him. Jesus Christ was that kind of leader. Great multitudes had been following him. Many people were excited about him. Some thought that as Messiah, he would drive out the Romans. Others were fascinated by his strange teachings and his mighty works. Others were just curious. To this crowd, Jesus said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple," as we read in Luke 14, verse 26. You see, crowding along behind him did not mean discipleship. And Jesus, with his stern language, makes this unmistakably clear. To further explain what he meant, he chose two illustrations. The first illustration is that of a man who wanted to build a tower. The tower was most likely a vineyard tower, as in Matthew 21, verse 33. Quite often in a well-kept vineyard, a tower was built to guard against those who might strip the vineyard in harvest time. Before a man could build a tower, would he not sit down and figure out exactly what it was going to cost? Otherwise, when he began to build and could not finish, he would become a laughingstock to all who saw him. Jesus, as a carpenter, had undoubtedly seen a number of men who began to build but ran out of funds before the job was completed. The second illustration is that of a king who contemplated war. Before engaging in the conflict, he calculates the odds and the risk involved. Is he able to stand against 20,000 with his 10,000? And his own soldiers well-trained and eager for battle? Can he advantage himself somehow with the element of surprise? If he cannot afford to do battle, he must send a delegation and ask for peace. But before looking at these two parables more closely, it is necessary to explore at greater length the kind of hatred Jesus demands. An easy and almost universal explanation is that Jesus did not intend for his words to be taken literally, that in reality he did not mean hate, but rather love less. Have y'all ever heard that? But this interpretation, along with many similar interpretations of his strong statements, run the risk of dulling the sharp edge of Jesus' command. What did Jesus mean when he said that we must hate our fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and wife? Concerning this paradox of hating others, several points should be noticed. First of all, the whole spirit of Jesus' teachings made it impossible that his disciples understand these words in their most literal meaning. Jesus did not seek to crush the tender relationships of human friendships and love. Far from hating their friends, and he called on his followers to love even their enemies. Remember? In Matthew chapter 5, he taught them that they must honor their parents and condemn the Pharisaic traditions that bypassed this solemn duty. as we read in Mark chapter 7, verses 9 through 13. He himself, when on the cross, committed the care of his mother to a trusted friend, as we read in John 19, verses 26 and 27. He spoke against anger and hatred of one's brother and said that it was a kind of murder in the Sermon on the Mount. Little children he gathered in his arms and blessed, as we read in Mark chapter 10. His teachings and the warm context of his entire life made it quite clear that men were to be loved. The word hate is not to be taken to mean that we are to love our relatives and friends with a diminished love. This would be opposed to the heart and soul of Christianity. Husbands are told to love their wives, even as Christ loved the church in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Christians are expected to cultivate a sincere love of the brethren, and to love one another earnestly from the heart, as Peter tells us in 1 Peter 1, verse 22. It is true that we may love the Lord too little, but we cannot love any human being too much. And we should never love the Lord more by loving our human friends less. The words "hate his own life" also supply the key to the problem. A disciple is to hate his relatives and friends in the same sense that he hates himself. In what sense is a man to hate himself? Well, he must hate whatever in himself is low and base. All that is greedy and selfish. Anything that would drag him away from Christ and rob his real self of true values. In the same way, he is to hate his relatives and friends. He ought to love them as he loves himself, and he ought to hate them as he hates himself. Whatever in them is pure and right, he is to love. Whatever is clean and self-indulgent, he is to hate. And if a man's friends come to stand between him and his Lord, if a choice has to be made between natural affection and devotion to Jesus Christ, then true disciples must be ready to treat their dearest friends as hated enemies. Now, looking at the challenge we find here, if Jesus' stern conditions of discipleship are regarded as detriments to superficial enthusiasm, they may also be regarded as challenges to those whose ambition is to live an active and vigorous life. Jesus was uncompromisingly honest. He did not, like most recruiting officers, keep back the difficult and dangerous in order to enlist men in his service. He wanted no one to come after him under false illusions. Men would have to face up to the task or not follow him at all. So Jesus taught that men must count the cost if they wish to be his disciples. This is the lesson of the parables on the hasty builder and the reckless king. A man would be foolish to build a tower without estimating the cost, and a king would be foolish to go out to war without taking into consideration the necessary risk, or how many men would he lose in the battle. A man who desires, or a woman who desires to follow Jesus Christ, must likewise see beforehand the hard and painful struggle that awaits him, and must be ready to make the sacrifices required no matter what the cost. Before one begins the Christian life, one should ask oneself several questions. First of all, ask oneself, am I willing to deny myself? When one starts out on the Christian way, it is the end of self. Self-denial is the first condition of discipleship. If anyone wishes to come after me, Jesus said, let him deny himself, as we read in Matthew 16, verse 24. By this, Jesus did not mean a temporary denial of self, a sacrifice of certain pleasures for a week or two in order that some good cause might be supported. To deny oneself is to live no longer to please the self. Paul wrote that he had been crucified with Christ. Galatians 2, verse 20. He had killed self. He had nailed his passions and lusts to the cross. And this is what he told the Colossian Christians that they must do. Colossians 3, verses 5 through 11. Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desires, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. For it is on account of these things that the wrath of God will come. And in them you also once walked, when you were living in them. But now you also put them all aside: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on a new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and free man. But Christ is all and is all. This is precisely what all men must do who sincerely seek him. And it is a bitter treatment that is required. No death is easy. C.S. Lewis expressed it like this: the Christian way is different. Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. I don't want to drill the tooth or crown it or stop it, but to have it out. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones you think wicked. The whole outfit. I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own shall become yours. That's what Jesus requires. To deny self is in every moment and in every way to say no to self and yes to Jesus Christ. Second question: am I willing to abide by his teachings? Before starting out on the Christian way, one should ask if one is willing to live by Jesus' teachings. Along with this, one needs to make sure that their mind is settled as to the claims of Jesus. He was born to be a king. We read Matthew 2, verse 2. He told Pilate that he was a king, as we read in John 18, verse 36. He professed to be the Christ, the Messiah foretold in the Old Testament, as we read in Mark 14, verse 61 and 62. He said that he was the world's light, John 8, verse 12. The one who could supply living water, in John 4, verse 10. The bread of life, in John 6, verse 35. And a few other claims that he made about himself. But in short, he claimed to be the Savior of the world. These were extraordinary claims even in that age. Any man would do well to review these claims once again, and in this current age of doubt, be convinced deep down in his own soul that these claims are indeed true. Commitment to Jesus' claims, however, involves living by his teachings. True discipleship means continuing in the words of Jesus. John 8, verse 31. Jesus, therefore, was saying to those Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, and I like that word abide because it means that you stay attached to. You don't let yourself loose from these teachings, from his sayings. If you abide in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine. This is a vital part of the cost that must be counted. It is as though Jesus says to multitudes of his would-be followers, you say you want to follow me, but are you willing to do what I say? Are you willing to be guided solely by my teaching? Instead of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, are you prepared to turn the other cheek or go the second mile? Will you love those who hate you? When men persecute you, will you pray for them? Are you ready to exchange earthly treasures for heavenly treasures? Without reservations or any strings attached, are you really willing to put my kingdom first? These are some of the questions that Jesus Christ asked every man. They are questions that sift the multitudes. They are questions that try men's souls. And the next question, and the last question is, am I willing to follow him to the end? There are many people who are eager to follow Jesus as long as the way is easy and pleasant. But when the going gets hard and the road stretches long, they give it all up. The parable of the tower presents this as a distinct possibility for every Christian. Many Christians, like the reckless builder, start out with a spurt but never finish. They make their big mistake in thinking that the Christian race is only a short distance. But life's race is not a quick, snappy sprint. It is a marathon race. And there is danger present even on the last lap. The Christian way lasts until the journey's end. And not until a man comes to know something of the toil and the length of that road has he fully counted the cost. So in conclusion, We find that Jesus in these parables does not intend to dampen enthusiasm, but he is saying that the real hard facts of the Christian way must be faced, or else red-hot enthusiasm will end up in cold despair. Nor does he mean that it is better not to begin than to begin and fail. He does mean, however, that it is better not to begin than to begin with a flourish of trumpets and a look of glamour that invites disaster. There is no challenge that compares to the Christian life, and no thrill that exceeds the thrill of the Christian way. But dying with him and taking up his cross is not easy. We must forsake all, and most of all, we must forsake ourselves. The lesson is yours, and I hope that I know that I'm preaching, as Terry says, to the choir, but there might be someone here this evening who realizes that they aren't running the race of following Jesus in the way in which we have spoken of tonight. It is difficult to deny self. It is difficult to follow Christ when hard times fall upon us. It is difficult to put Christ first above everyone else. But it is something that Jesus commands to us, that we must indeed count the cost in following him. If there's anyone who needs to respond in any way at this time, we encourage you to come now. As together we stand and we sing.
I must needs go home by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I shall ne'er get sight of the gate.